Before I make the call, U is 8.8, X is 52. After I make the call, the value of U has changed. It has changed from 8.8 to 5.2. What does that mean? It means that the function must be allowed to change the value of U, which means that in the prototype you must say that the second parameter is passed by reference. You got to put the ampersand there. Okay? This is going way too slow. All right. Hope we're on. Everybody's tight. I'm not sure I'm going to do the second one. I think I'm getting too tired. Got to live with the first one. That's all we can do. Okay, go down. Now, it says here, write code to declare an array named Florida Teams and initialize it with Jags. What is Jags, Dolphins, Bucks, and Rays? Those are the names of the teams. What data type is that? It's a string. So we need an array. The data type is string. The name is this. How many values do you have? 4. I gave you 4 values. What are those values? They must be string values. So I've got to put a double quote around each because these are string values. Okay? Done. All right. We have 2 arrays now, A and B. One contains 74 values, the other 32. Now, here are some functions. For the class, for the 330 class, I left out this function. I should have had this function in here. It would have made your job easier. All right? Now, complete code to determine and display the smallest of all the values in the 2 arrays. What does that mean? Of the 2 arrays, you got to find the smallest one in A, the smallest one in B, and then decide which of those 2 is the overall smallest. So we need variables, minimum of A, minimum of B, and the overall smallest. So how do we get the minimum of A? Call the function min. You have to pass it an integer array. But we said A is an integer array, and we know how many elements it has. So we're going to get the minimum of A, then the minimum of B. And then the smallest is the result of calling the function smaller, passing it these 2 results. The smallest one in A, smallest one in B, the smallest of those 2 is what smallest is. Because these functions return values, we could have called it a different way. We could have said, call this and get the smallest one in A, and then the smallest one in B, and then determine which is smaller of those 2. If you don't use smaller, you can just get the 2 mins, and if min A is less than or equal to min, just say the overall min is min A. Otherwise, it's the min B. Lose my voice. Now, declare an array suggested by the code below. If this is the loop to go through the array, the subscripts will go from 0 to 1844. How many values is that? If I went from 0 to 3, how many values would that be? 0, 1, 2, and 3. So it would be 4 values. So how many values are in the array? It's this number plus 1. So there are 1845 values. So when I declare this thing, I will say I need capacity of 1845. All right, write the header for the functions below. Let's take a look at the calls. Well, first of all, we say the first call I have 3 parameters. Second call I have 3. The next one I have 3. And the next one I have 2. All right? So this is an example of a function that can have a variable number of parameters. And we discussed in class the mechanism for doing that is to have a default parameter. All right. So this function takes 3. It is possible to omit the third one. So the question is, if I omit the third one, what value must I use for must be the default value? What must be the default value? Let's take a look. If I call it with these 3 numbers, what happens? Okay, I display 6. So somehow I take 5 and 4 and 3 and I make a 6. Well, you might get better insight here. If I call it and the third number is a 3, the third argument is a 3, what's the answer? I called it with y, which is 4, z, which is 3, and it produces the number 7. So it looks like I'm adding these 2 numbers, and then I'm doing something with the third thing. The next call says I'm calling it with the same first 2 parameters. This gave me a 7. When I call it with the third parameter being 2, I go from 7 to 5. What does that mean? It looks like I've taken the sum of y and z, which would have been 9 plus 4 plus 3, which would have been 7, and I must be subtracting the 2 from it. So it looks like when I omit the parameter, I get the same value as I got up here. When the parameter was a t, I get the same value when I omit it. So it looks like the default parameter must have been a 0. And that's all this was asking. It also says, what's the body? The body says, what are you doing to produce the answer? And as we saw, I'm adding the first 2 parameters, then I'm subtracting the third. All right? All right, that required some paying attention. All right, let's go ahead and knock this out. All right, let's do the trace. Now, this is going to be a long video, my goodness. Okay, this has a static variable. All you need to worry about is a static local variable is still a local variable. It really has no impact on the trace. Is that clear? It may impact the values you return, but it has no impact on the trace. So we start the main 5, 6, 7. At 7 we call the function, which is 1, 2, 3, 4. And the function returns back to 7. That's the first call. Then we move to line 8. There's a call on line 8. And we come back to line 8. And then we do line 9. That was worth 5 points. Okay? Now, what value is returned? Well, on the first call, the variable all is 0, and I'm passing it a 2. So I add 2 to all and I return all. So the thing that gets returned is a 2. So 2 is stored in sum. Okay. Next call. When I enter the function, all is a 2 because the last time I left this function, all was a 2. And I'm passing a 5. So what are we going to do? We're going to add the 5 to all, or we're going to add 5 to 2, and that becomes a 7. Right? And that's the value we're going to return. It's a 7. All right? And finally, is that all? That's not all. Doggone it. This is taking too long. I regret this. Okay. Next time, what's going to happen? The thing most of y'all kind of fell apart on was when I make the call in line 7. I make the call, and this is the first call. Right here. It ends here. Then I immediately make the second call, and that call is from here to here. Okay? And if you pay attention to the value, First time I call it and I pass it a 5, so the value of all is a 5 and a 5 is returned. So that's like 5 comes here. When I call it the second time, C is 8. I add 8 to 5, which is a 13, and that's the value that gets returned is a 13. So it's the 5 and the 13 that get added together to produce 18. But you have two calls from the same line, and you got to make those calls. Most of you never realized you had a second call. All right. Now, design and write a function named small that returns the smallest value in an array. Okay, I didn't say int, but it could have been any data type. It's going to return an integer. It's going to take an integer array, and when you pass an array, you pass the size. And just like we did it in class, you need a local variable, set it to the first value, and then go through the array and change the minimum as you need to and return the minimum. Now this is something I didn't want you to go crazy on, but most of you did. Here's a character array, and that's what a C string is. But a character array is just like an int array. So I have the ability to look at every element in the array, every character, and I can compare it. So this says count the number of times the character A appears. So I have a counting problem. I set it to 0. I've got to walk through the string. The length of the string is line length. I've got to go through that and compare character by character. If I start with the first element, if